it is a very good morning to all the viewers watching us from the rest of the continent. We're coming to you from the heart or the seat of power here in South Africa, that is the capital, the city of Tshwane. Today, the city is hosting its Trade and Investment Summit, and it's hoping to showcase the investment opportunities and pipeline it has in store for investors. Of course, you would be aware right now, quite a number of investment summits happening underway here in South Africa, and this is all related to the national drive to shore in some 5 trillion rands in investments to grow the economy and create jobs. Before we get into the nitty-gritties as to what the city exactly has in store, 5 key areas that they're wanting to attract some 10 billion rand investments in over the current term, we are going to have a presentation that will set the scene as to the role that cities play specifically in attracting investments and growing the economy. Of course, it's business unusual in South Africa right now, as the top-down approach to growing the economy can no longer, or is no longer working. It's now a bottoms-up approach, and this is what cities all over are doing. So to help us set the tone for exactly the work that cities should be doing to drive economic development, I am joined by Professor Ronald Wall from the Wits University, who will give us a brief presentation.
Thank you very much. So good morning to everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to present. A very short introduction to myself. I'm originally, of course, South African. I've lived in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, for 35 years. And in March this year, I came back to try and see if I can help contribute to this country, which I like. The main thing I'm trying to show today is that the field of economic geography might be very interesting for future development because it's evidence-based spatial understanding of how firms and industries cluster. And in my opinion, often cities are planned by planners, and then we hope those cities will be filled up with economic programs, when actually, in my view, we should first use evidence-based research to find out what type of industries and clusters we have a chance in competing and collaborating, and use that as a basis for planning. So I hope that will be inspiring. So I'm going to show you research that was done for the United Nations in Nairobi, and it's not looking specifically at Tshwane, but it's showing the position of African cities in the world investment flows. And it's quite unique research because it's not country-to-country data, but city-to-city. So it shows you the evidence of how we position ourselves and change across the globe. So the report came out last year. It's State of African Cities 2018. The Geography of African Investment. You can look it up online and download it for free. It's in French and also in English. There are 18 thematic areas. It's about a 300-page report, and only the ones that are highlighted in blue I will discuss today. But for those interested in the other themes, please feel free to look. It was developed by Wits University, Erasmus University, where I was formerly professor, but also with UN Habitat in Nairobi, the African Development Bank, and also UK Aid, or DFID in the UK. So for those people who don't know what FDI is, it means foreign direct investment, and please realize my whole presentation today is only looking at foreign investment, not looking at domestic investment, because I don't have that data for all countries. But in any case, it's a very important type of data. FDI means investment that crosses the border. So it must come from, let's say, Lagos into Johannesburg, but it doesn't include investment, let's say, from Durban into Johannesburg. So that's just to make it clear what we're looking at. The second point says, well, a lot of research does show that foreign investment does lead to economic growth, but in many cases it could increase income inequality. So you have to understand what you're doing with the investment to make sure that it doesn't have a negative effect. Now, thirdly, what I can introduce to you is a kind of very new type of research field. It's called network analysis. It's a branch of econometrics in which we understand the positions of cities within regions. So it could be like Tshwane's position in Gauteng, or in South Africa, or in SADC, or in continental Africa, or even in the world. And it gives you a very new insight into what our cities mean. And that's what I'm going to be showing a lot of today. So what is the geography of foreign investment into cities? Okay, so I've developed a database of over 200,000 investments to cities around the world. So what you see here is not my picture of what it looks like. It's a three-dimensional GIS simulation based on software. And this is the investments that have taken place in over 1,200 cities in the world in the last 15 years. So the bigger the spikes just means those cities get the most investment in that time. And when you see huge concentrations of investment like we'll see now in the US, you can see certain areas get all the investment. So we can see where Mr. Trump is, and we see quite clearly this powerful region of investment. And that raises questions. Why? What are the reasons why investment clustered there, or on the right, as you can see, in Europe? And as we go down to the global south, where most people live, we see that besides a few very big peaks, the distribution of investment into the south is not that impressive yet. Although I must say the growth of investment into the south is rapidly changing. So that's very interesting for Africa and Latin America. By the way, this whole presentation will be provided later, so you can all look at it in more detail later. Now, if you take that data, you can also just simply aggregate it to regions of the world. Now, what I found very interesting is this is the line of no growth, and this side is positive growth, this side is negative growth. And we see Africa, although the volume of investment it gets in this time period is quite small, it's the second biggest growth region of investment in this time period. So it's changing very quickly. Only North America stands ahead of that. Now, the same data can be mapped using GIS. And as I said, over 200,000 investments. If I would switch it all on, then you would see just lines everywhere. So this is the top 10,000 major investments in the world. So you can quite quickly see the inequality of investment. Everything is up in the global north. Much investment takes place between Europe and North America or Pacific Asia, and some connections are to the south. But remembering that how many people live in the south, it's an interesting phenomenon. So what do we do about it? How do we change this scenario to make sure more investment comes to us? And please realize, often people are anti-investment, saying it's not good for development. But just look how much investment takes place between Europe and North America. So it shows you there's no bias in investment. There are certain qualities on both sides that make investors invest to a huge degree between each other. So we need to look in South Africa or Africa, Gauteng or Tshwane to see how can we develop a competitive edge to attract more investment to us. Now we can see that Gauteng has a super good connection. Considering that there are over 1,200 cities in the database, Gauteng is number 69, which is very impressive. It's one thing I think we should take home with us. Another thing I've shown in my research is Cairo gets the most investment, but it gets its investment from the Middle East and a bit of Europe. But Joburg gets its investments from all over the world. So I would say that Gauteng is the only global African city so far because of its impressive reach. Now, if you switch on only the investments to Africa, we see that Europe is still by far the biggest investor in Africa. Now, it's true that China and those places have the highest growth rates into Africa, but the volumes of investment still come from Europe. That's why the relationship of the African Union and the EU is something important to strengthen in the future, besides, of course, our relations with Asia as well and with the US. So we can see here the biggest investors into Africa are Paris, Lagos, Dubai, and Johannesburg. So Johannesburg is also a big investor. And the biggest recipients of investment are firstly Cairo, then Johannesburg, and then a number of North African cities. Now here we see an interesting thing. Gauteng is a very important gateway into the rest of Africa. So those gray lines that are shining out from Gauteng into Africa, you can see it's the spider in the web of investment into Africa. And it's therefore not surprising that China invests most in Gauteng, not only because of our market, but because of the access from Gauteng into the rest of Africa. Now that's something we need to capitalize on. We should be promoting our students and our businesses to actually do business in Africa, get returns on investment, but also invest in, for instance, infrastructure, and therefore make connections which will bring us bigger markets far away. So let's not only think inwards, but also start thinking outwards. So Johannesburg is the key investor into Africa, followed by Casablanca from the north, and then third is Lagos. Besides that, Gauteng has the biggest amount of homegrown multinationals, let's say black multinationals in the whole of Africa. That business power should be promoted by our governments and sent throughout Africa. I've always said that Johannesburg has the potential to become the London of Africa. It's powerful in financial and business services, sectors that are not easy to replicate. And that's why working and servicing and helping throughout Africa for new business activity is essential. Now, don't worry too much about the statistics. The main thing what we tested here is looking at 160 major cities of the world, their economic regional networks. To what degree does a thickness of regional power attract foreign investment from far away? And we found that it's highly significant. But in Africa, those regional networks are still quite weak. So we have to now capitalize on the new African trade agreement because we need to power up our regions first, and naturally the investments will maximize towards us. That's the message from this analysis. Now, some things that matter to investors in Africa. Now, we firstly found that women's participation in the labor force doesn't have significance for African investment. But we compared it to investment in Asia, where it's extremely significant and positive. So the message here is that although women work in agriculture and informal economies, we have to make sure that women participate much more in the formal businesses and industries. That alone will already maximize investment into African cities. Then the usual things, domestic market is important, trustworthiness, business climate. Corruption across Africa has a deterring effect on investment. So this is simply coming out of statistical models. I'm not giving any preference to it. And the last three just show that the more democratic a country is in Africa, the more investment it attracts. So creating an open-mindedness, democratic society is something very important for continental and global investment. Now, if you look at why companies choose to go to African cities, these from top to bottom are the main reasons. The first is the regional market, of course, its growth. Second is the proximity to markets, not only, let's say, Gauteng, but investors might be interested in the whole region going to Zimbabwe and Mozambique. So as they can maximize on that kind of super region, will actually give them much more interest to invest here. Now, the yellow ones are the ones that are number one in Europe, but they should also become important for Africa. So in Europe, number one is the skilled workforce availability. That's the number one attractor of investment. And we need to make sure that our schools and universities are geared to the industrial sectors growing in the world and investment flows. So we make our students with the reality, and in that sense, build industries here to grow. It's actually this factor that gives us income inequality. But once you take care of skills, then foreign firms are interested in attracting local people to work for them, which then has a spillover effect and therefore decreases income inequality. So this is essential. Infrastructure and logistics, okay, that's very important. We need to make sure that if we choose, for instance, healthcare in Tshwane or biotech, that we have a supportive local industrial cluster that can absorb that and that can work with it. So it's important to have evidence-based work before you make policy and start planning cities with maybe have no potential of growing. So I would say, please, let's first do analysis before we jump too quickly to conclusions on how to program Gauteng or a city like Tshwane. Another important one is IPAs. So for Europe, investment promotion agencies are really fascinating, well-developed organizations that actually use state-of-the-art technologies and policies to go out into the world of investment and hunt for firms to bring to their cities. But you need to make sure your city has the capacity to match what those investors want. So it's an interesting thing that I would promote, if I could, in Tshwane, is a state-of-the-art IPA center. The one underneath is attractiveness. Many studies have shown you would think the attractiveness of a city is not important to investment, but it's extremely important, especially for knowledge-intensive type investments. So beautifying the city is not just for architects who are in a dream world. It's very important also economically. I've proven it in a paper in Urban Studies quite recently, that actually the design of the city contributes a small part to explaining why investments take place in world cities. Okay, looking at African investment, this is the forecast we did in the report. It shows that around 2019, investments in Africa will pick up. Not only did it pick up, but it's picked up in the last 3 much more than we estimated. So Africa's booming. It's now, in the last 3 years, the #1 growth investment region of the world. And then it makes you wonder why, in such a booming continent, is South Africa, Gauteng, or Tshwane, or Ekurhuleni, why are we not capitalizing on that? And that's, to me, the main reason is that we simply need to get our politics right, because we've got all the other equipment of a city to do extremely well. So I hope that's a positive message, that let's try to get on with business from now on. If we look in South Africa, similar expectations around 2019, 2020, investments should start to emerge again. But, of course, that's not taking into consideration the local problems that the country is going through, which could actually send it into a fiscal cliff or the other way around. So this just shows you foreign investment growth into Gauteng, and we have seen that, unfortunately, since about 2011, there's been a sharp decline of investment. But it is actually good to see around 2018 there is some positive growth, and I hope we can start to push that for future industries. So who are the foreign investment competitors of African cities? Now, what I'm going to show you now is something a bit technical, and you don't have to worry about it, that you don't understand it. It's a bit econometric. But I'm just trying to show you that if we want to really plan our cities, we need to measure them properly within this huge network of investment flows to get a better understanding. So I'm being a bit cheeky. I'm going to show you something that might be distracting for a while. firstly, in theory, we all think our cities are all competing for the same types of investments. So we often think that Cape Town and Joburg and Casablanca are all just actually trying to attract the same investments, but actually that's not the case, as I will show. So we're not then sure who are our real competitors, the ones that are actually really fighting for the same types of investments. And these place wars, they take place not only here in Gauteng or in South Africa or in the continent, they take place at all scales of the world. And they all have different influence on the outcome or fate of our cities. So there's a formula just to show you that these things aren't just sucked out of our thumbs, but don't worry about the technicalities. I just want to show you, though, because I'm sure everyone will understand. Imagine the world consisted of 7 cities, right? Cities A to G. And those lines between the cities are investments. Now, this model measures your competitiveness within investments. So in the case of city A and city G, we can see A gets its investments from B and C, G gets its investments from F and E, so technically there's no competition because they are invested by different cities, right? So there's a 0% market overlap. Now if you take cities B and C, we can see they both get their investments from A and D, right? So that makes them 100% market overlap. And if we look at cities A and D, we can see that D also gets investments from E and F. So it has a percentage overlap between. Now, of course, it's humanly impossible to do that in a database of over 200,000 connections. But using software, you get an immediate answer of who your competitors are. So the model does that, but it also looks at the sectors of investment, the amount of dollars per investment, and the origin of the investment. So it's a bit complicated, but when you run it, it tells you interesting things. Now, in the case of Johannesburg, or let's say Gauteng, out of all these cities, it finds that the number one competitor of Gauteng is Bogota in Colombia. It means that those two cities have almost the same investment profile based on these sectors here. You can see the lines are following business service, financial service. If they were 100% overlap, there would just be one line because they would fall perfectly on top of each other. Now, when you run the same model for Cairo over here, you see its number one competitor is Vilnius, followed by Al-Manama in the Middle East. So it shows you we need to use these instruments to find out first who are our competitors before we do case studies on these cities to find out what makes them more competitive with us. Now, when you do that, you can get the results for whatever you like. So here we see Joburg. First competitor is Bogota internationally, then Chicago, then Istanbul, then Delhi, then Buenos Aires. If you restrain the model to Africa, you do in fact find that Cape Town is number one, but then Casablanca is its second competitor. So it's not technically constrained spatially by the model, but functionally, economically, these are Joburg's African competitors in that row. If you take a city like Shanghai, you can see it competes with the big guys. So it's almost like boxing. You've got the heavyweights, the middleweights, and the lightweights. You can see here, Shanghai competes with the very big types of cities, right? And this is not because I chose them. This is the outcome of that model. If you look at a smaller place like Abidjan, you can see that it's got quite a few African cities, but they could have been any city in the world. So economically, this is kind of the connection that it makes. So I'm just trying to show you a way we can start empirically finding out for Gauteng or for Tshwane, for any other city, exactly who we are dealing with. This just shows you that the investors for those cities are from different parts of the world. So it shows you the geographies of cities investing in us, like in this case, Johannesburg versus Cairo. have completely different geographies of investment coming in. I'll skip these two. This is just to show you we can find out how many competitors you have. So Shanghai has no competitors in this case. And not working. And if you take a city like Kigali, this arrow is shorter, means it has many competitors.
I do believe that many of you have a fancy gadget before you on your desks. I do understand that it's how you and I communicate as audience members. So if there are any questions that you might have throughout the discussion, or maybe any questions that you have in response to the presentation that the Prof has given, use your fancy gadget and I'll see you and then we can ask away. To continue where you left off, Prof, and thanks so much for setting the scene for us, but perhaps let's hear from our host, the mayor, first. The professor has told us that there is money around, there's money looking for a home, and that's quite significant despite the fact that the world is quite a tricky place to be in right now. The money is there, but as the southern part of Africa, particularly South Africa, we're not doing enough to bring it our way. You've invited us here to tell us about 10 billion rand worth of projects that are on the pipeline. Just give us more details.
Well, thank you very much, Fifi. I think the Prof have set the tone very well in terms of ensuring that there is a competitive space out there. Cities are competing. And it is survival of the fittest. And it is for that reason you have such trade and investment summits where you can showcase what we have as a city, what you can offer. And I like your opening statement where you said that the cities are the engine of growth and the top-bottom approach has now been surpassed by the bottom-up approach. And yes, of course, one of the cardinal sins as Africans is that we are not doing much trade against each other. The Africa Free Trade area gives us that opportunity to ensure that we expand our trade. But I think one of the engines of the cities is also about attraction of foreign direct investment. And we got to make conducive environment. Us as a government is to make sure that we open the playing field and we open up the space and we create a conducive environment with what Prof was saying. We remove all those barriers. And that is why my tagline is from red tape to red carpet, meaning that we need to deal with all those bureaucracies that hinders development. And local government is one of the highly legislated spheres of government, out of the 3 spheres of government. And you always go through those hurdles. And that is why I've created what we call STRIC, which is a Strategic Investment Committee, which really fast-track development to ensure that all our line function departments gather in one room and evaluate the development and we move forward. So we are here to ensure that we show you in terms of those 5 key strategic portfolios that I have presented in terms of the opportunities that are there. We will be also unveiling some of the 10 strategic land parcels that we are putting forward. One of the issues that we are not doing as a city is to have prototype developments. We need to guide development. We need to showcase where are our development nodes, where are our potential, so that when investors and developers come, we've already prepared the land, we've prepared the whole issue around bulk infrastructure, and we redirect development. At this point in time, we are doing development sporadically. Somebody just come and say, a developer comes and say, I want to develop a hotel. We just say, okay, go develop there. And they come, and it creates that sporadic tension in terms of our spatial development. So
of course,
one thing
Mayor,
that we need to do
we do
is
know
to...
that the investors are already here. In fact, you've got one of them that's seated right next to you from the IFC. In terms of the investment case of the city of Tshwane, what you have heard here so far, what do you make of it regarding deploying capital into the city?
Okay, so thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just to add first to what the professors mentioned about some statistics in terms of where the cities, the role the cities play worldwide. 80% of global domestic product worldwide comes from cities. And then urbanization, if you take the African continent, is growing 14%. It's like 32 million new people coming into the cities. And between, according to the UN projection, 56% of Africans will live in cities by 2050. That is huge market if you take it from that perspective. So now coming back to the city of Tshwane and the project presented by the city. So what is important is the proactiveness, identifying the sectors, going out, showcasing those sectors, and then it's very rare to see cities really going that way. Usually, as the mayor mentioned, you'll have people waiting, and then you don't control the space of development, you don't control the type of industries you want. And the mayor also mentioned the African free trade area. So now, Nairobi, Lagos, Tshwane, and Cairo, what will these cities could do together, for example? What type of product? They don't need to assemble everything in one city. What could one city produce that the other one doesn't have? And then, that is where you start having the market and the scale, really, to now compete in a global world.
I mean, Prof. Stevens, to bring you in here, when you look at the economy of Tshwane and you look at what it could capitalize on, as we did here, Prof. Ronald talking about how we need to capitalize on the money that is out there that is looking for a home. I mean, they've identified 5 strategic sectors so far, being property, agro-processing, energy, renewable energy falling in that component as well, amongst others. But of those, what do you think that greater focus should be directed to?
That's an excellent question. I think partly there's the South African reality, which is there's clearly a need for energy. It's hard to deny that that's not an absolute must. And I would encourage as much thought to go into that as well. And you know, the other thing that you think about is sort of following along on the previous comments. What are the things that we are doing, right? So the automobile zone is, I think, a very useful strategy. It's much more difficult to start from absolute scratch than it is to start with a set of skills that you already have and build further. So I think that's an excellent place to continue. The question I think that the first presenter also sort of highlighted was, you know, the need to, well, the developed world is thinking hard, or investors are thinking hard about skills and as well as access to markets. And one of the things that we struggle with quite a bit in Africa generally, in the country generally, and even a bit in the city, is transportation. We need to get workers to jobs, we need to get products to markets, unfinished goods across countries to be completed. So there's quite a bit of work to think about along those lines.
You just one last time as we focus on the key areas that you're trying to attract capital to. I mean, we know that the city of Tshwane, the automotive sector is quite vibing recently. Yes. The president with Nissan regarding their 3 billion rand injection. So energy, a whole lot of sun here, so it makes for good. Solar construction, I'm interested in your views there, as many companies around us are going bust. Property, agro-processing, and even tourism. Of course, many of those sectors also do have a bit of policy headaches attached to them. We all know them in this room. Mayor, you'll just shed light on it to say that if people are deciding to put capital in your city right now, what assurances do they have that there'll be policy continuity?
No. Definitely, I think policy certainty and stability is one of the major issues when it comes to investment. And it is for that reason that I've made a clear call that Tshwane is open for business. So there is certainty, And as I was saying, that I have created that committee, which is called STRICT, for strategic investment, to ensure that we put strategic investment on the conveyor belt so that it doesn't get to be hawked by bureaucracy of the system. Now, you have mentioned about those 5 key strategic areas. We are strong in the automotive cluster. And I think what we need to do, and the vision moving forward, it is to consolidate that automotive cluster, linking it with the Vulnerable Airport so that we can have a logistical hub. Because it's still something that we need to work on, that the auto industry in Roslyn still gets their components in Richards Bay, while they can get them from the Vulnerable Airport. So I'm working on a strategy to commercialize and make Vulnerable a commercial asset that we can use as a city. Secondly, it's agro-processing. We are the 3rd largest city in the world behind New York and Tokyo because of our agricultural footprint. We are almost 70% rural. So that gives us an opportunity for us to grow in the agro-processing field. And I mean, tourism. We are the only city where the Union Building is situated, and where you have the Ford Tracker Monument and the Freedom Park sitting side by side. So those are unique things. You drive 10 kilometers from here, you can see the Big 5. So this is one of those things that we need to do. And by the way, we've got our own brew. We've got Mamelodi beer as well.
So you've got a whole lot going on there. Prof. Ronald, in terms of how business can access these opportunities, right now we do know the importance of small businesses in driving economic growth and job creation, specifically small businesses and young people. So talk to me about what cities need to be doing to ensure that as they do grow and attract investments, they grow inclusively.
Yes, I think that's extremely important. I think one thing that African cities should consider is the developed world cities have actually given us the highest inequality rates in the world and the highest climate impact, but sell their models of the city to us. Now, I think we need to step back and think, what are we doing? What cities are we creating? And in my vision, that would be an African city, which doesn't look like an African city, but I think we have to respect informal and formal economic processes. They are dual systems which sort of work besides each other. They sometimes connect, but they're like 2 strands of a DNA. Those 2 strands of a DNA need connections between them, and the connections are too weak. So we have to respect that the economy is an informal and a formal, so it's the invisible hands of the economy which we need. And why I say that is actually the whole world is informalizing. The developed world is increasingly becoming informal. Take a city like Rotterdam, where I lived, is now up to about 20% of its city GDP is through informal process. Moscow is up to 50%. So we might be actually providing models to the world of how an informal, formal duality can work together in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't see the informal as something like a disease we have to correct. I think it's because government simply can't provide the services to everyone, therefore should actually nurture informal processes to work together with formal ones and find the connection. So my last point is, I see the whole economy as a pyramid, from big multinationals to big national firms to small, medium enterprise, and at the bottom is a big layer of informal business. And this pyramid is full of holes, and we need to start connecting it to make the supply chain go all the way down to informal business and back. And I think that's a wonderful thing for professors like us to start to look at. Gauteng might become the actual model to the world of the future city, and not some glorious image of Western utopia like Toronto or Singapore. We need to really think what we are doing before we follow too much the World Bank and African Development Bank, strictly trying to promote a formal economy, but we need to find our own way.
Let's hear from the World Bank what they say about what you have just said right now.
No,
I mean, of course, Adamo, he's speaking to the importance of strengthening public-private partnerships. And this is something that you did mention, to say that although there is an infrastructure gap and deficit here in the country, it also presents an opportunity, and it presents an opportunity for business and government and the private and the public sector to work together more strongly. So for that to happen, what needs to happen?
Okay, thank you so much. So for that to happen, you really need the regulatory framework that is, as the mayor mentioned, something that is previsible. So you know what will happen, you know that you are working in a specific framework. It wouldn't change in the coming 10, 15, 20 years, because this investment in infrastructure is really, you are looking at long-term horizon. So that is one important thing. The second is really bringing in the private sector and seeing, when you look at not only here in South Africa, across the world, government have less and less funding when it comes to infrastructure and other areas. So then leveraging now the private sector is really key in some of these areas. And the private sector, eventually, they would like some return. So it's about, again, risk allocation, who will take which risk. For example, if there is a road, who will have to compensate the resident. So perhaps that will be the role of the government or the city. If there is a housing development to take place, perhaps the city should provide the land and then give some instruction or some guidance to the private sector to say, oh, you can build this much of low-cost housing or affordable housing, but the remaining 20 or 30%, you can do whatever you want to cross-subsidize. So it's really looking at a win-win solution where the two sit together, not against each other, but sit together and see how to leverage the strength of each other.
All right, so we do have some questions coming through, and thank you so much for your engagement. And Mayor, this is for you. You dropped us with a very nice line about, taking out the red tape and throwing forward that red carpet. Exactly what does that entail is a question that has come from the floor.
Well, I think it entails what Adam just said now. It's about making that our bureaucracy is shortened in terms of development. When we have to process development proposals, for example, we don't have to take 6 months. We have to shorten it. When we have town planning establishment regulations, we need to shorten those. And when we have those discussions, as Adama was saying, they are shortened. And it is for that reason that I emphasize the creation of the district, which is getting all the relevant departments within the city in one room to evaluate a development so that when it gets out of there, it's on the fast lane for development. That's what it means, essentially.
All right, thank you. Mayor, we'll get more questions regarding skills and exactly how the city is preparing itself for skills development, but perhaps from an economist or an economist's point of view. I mean, you well in tune with the skills gap that South Africa has in certain areas. We've got strengths and we've also got weaknesses. In terms of addressing the weaknesses in skills, what should government, national and provincial, be doing to close that gap?
If you had the answer, we wouldn't have to be here, I suppose. Again, we sit there with, I think, a general view of all of these things, which is some of things are difficult yet sort of obvious. We have mothers of children who travel for hours to get to work and leave outrageously early. And there's nobody around with the kids, or maybe a grandparent, and the children aren't necessarily getting the sort of support and nurturement that they might need. They're not necessarily getting even access to the education that they need. This isn't just a city problem, right? It's a broader problem than that. But these are the sorts of things that need to be thought about very hard to address really some of the skills gaps, the inequality issues, right? There are things that have been going on around the world with trying to support childcare and a number of things like this that might seem to be I don't know, maybe not big enough issues.
For sure.
But they're the kinds of things that would make very large impacts across a large number of people.
For sure. Mayor, quite a lot of interest in exactly how people access this 10 billion rand pipeline of projects. They want to know specifically, how does business, us entrepreneurs, young people, how do we get in touch with these projects?
Well, of course. I mean, that is what we will be showcasing.
Okay.
It is part of the booklet that we have. If you go to the TTIS website, you will see what we are showcasing, and you have the exhibitors also out there. So it is what we are launching as a city, and it's for that reason why we have called it TTIS. It is for us to showcase and show what are those opportunities within the city. So the information is readily available, and it's part of the program of this 2-day investment summit. Tomorrow you will be going to do oversight and going for site inspections within those 5 key sectors where you can look and where we will be showcasing our investment potential. So it is part of what we are doing. And part of why we are here, it is to showcase those opportunities.
All right, and just drumming it down to Tshwane specifically, Prof. Ronald, you did speak quite a bit about Gauteng, and you did speak quite a bit about Johannesburg. But what can this city do to position itself as a first choice or a high up-ranking choice for investments?
I was looking through the recent data last night, and I was quite surprised to see there's a lot of investment in pharmaceuticals. And in the Netherlands, I did similar research, and what we do is we try to create...
Let me just jump in there, just real quick. Can I just ask you to speak up? I think there's some audience members at the back that can't hear.
Okay, sorry. One of the investment areas I saw that was quite high is pharmaceuticals. I've done a similar research in the Netherlands where we try to find co-clusters. So we say skill-relatedness of firms gives you more sustainability. And what you could do is say, well, we're quite strong already in pharmaceuticals. We can tie that to renewable energy, which is a related sector, healthcare, and especially biotech, in which we are not strong. So you create this kind of new life sciences green bubble where you can link that to healthcare and all that. So I think thinking about sectors that actually co-create and locate together is very important. So that's kind of one, I could say, without much analysis, I must admit. And then the last tip I would say is that I think this is a wonderful event, and I think we should market Tshwane on its own, but also consider that we're living in one of the biggest megalopolises in the world. And we should also market the province as a whole, because marketing the whole province will attract big guys from around the world, and then we divide the spoils amongst the cities. So I think we need to look at what is every city like Ekurhuleni, Soweto, Joburg, all the different ones. What is everyone good at, and how can we become a complementary system? In that way, we can work together. So, for instance, Joburg is very good at chemicals, but Pretoria is not. But for pharmaceuticals, you need chemicals. So you can start creating these healthy ties together and market it at provincial level, but make sure we have a good deal about how we divide the spoils amongst cities, which is not easy. I did the same in Holland, and of course it's all well intended, but then you see that everyone starts fighting about what. But if we can find ways of political mechanisms to combine that, I think this can become really one of the top economic hubs in the world, and also a source to Africa for all kinds of business.
For sure. Mayor, I mean, I'm sure you'd agree with me to say that investment it's a give and take, right? In as much as we're saying, come, we're open for business, there are expectations that the city has on its investors, and perhaps you can speak to some of them and whether it entails certain empowerment checking, and also, Adamo, if you can just add to some of what the mayor has to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Fifi, those are regulatory and legislative mandates. And I think as a city, we know exception around that. I think the main important one for us is to ensure that there is policy certainty, there is stability, and that our processes are very consistent and they are able to respond effectively and efficiently. And that is why the development of smart cities moving forward is a reality, because of it means we got to integrate our services and our systems to respond quite quicker in this space of the 5G technology. So apart from normal legislative regulations, I think for us it is about also ensuring that there is youth entrepreneurship, there is skills development and skills transfer. Because of in the process and the line chain of investment, we always forget one important aspect, which is about skills transfer. And it's about local beneficiation as well, which is quite important because of we develop and invest in communities, and it's important that we take communities along.
Adamo, I mean, just to add to that, and also in terms of when the IFC is looking at deploying capital to businesses and investors who are wanting to capitalize on projects, the empowerment aspect, I mean, quite often we speak with multinationals who say that, I mean, what do they have to do with BEE? But as the mayor did say, it is the cost of doing business here. Has it been digested? Has it been accepted generally now by foreign investors by way of deploying capital in South Africa?
Yes, I think when you look at a country, you have to abide by the rules and the laws of the country to make an investment. So that is one law, then people have to abide. And also when we invest in companies, we also look at that aspect to make sure that the company is law-abiding. And in addition to that, we look at the environmental and social standard, so to make sure that not only the company does what the product they intend to do, but they are also doing good for the environment. One other area we look at is ethical standards to make sure that the company is a good corporate citizen. And then the mayor mentioned a little bit about it. It's about linkages. How does this project links to the rest of the economy? Then you have the pool of small and medium-sized enterprises. How could they bring them in their value chain or their supply chain? So within the World Bank Group, we have a lot of tools where we can help those companies really bring in the small and medium-sized enterprises into their value chain. And in that, we work very closely with either the municipality or the provincial government or the national government to make that happen. So if I take the example of Guinea-Conakry, which is a country that is a mining country. So what has happened over decades is that there was very small linkages with the rest of the economy. So we selected a group of small and medium-sized enterprises together with the mining companies. We provided the training, and then on a website, then those companies are listed. So each time a company needs a service, they know where to go, and then they will, because those companies have the right standards. So there is a lot that could be done, but you need the private sector, you need the public sector, and then once they sit and then they start looking at how to leverage each other, in many instances, they are fighting each other. But if they really leverage each other, then they will solve a lot of issues.
Sure. Prof. Stevens, I mean, just as we wrap up, the climate change considered one of those, longer-term risks that will catch most of us by surprise, because right now we were dealing with bread and butter issues. We've spoken about smart cities, development, but just add to that the importance of ensuring that these projects that we are putting through the development pipeline are also green projects. So we're talking about the development of smart green cities too.
Yeah, and minimal water use cities, right? A number of things that we need to take very, very carefully. You probably said it better than I can. The issues that matter are if you're going to invest in a city or a location, you need to be able to believe that you can be there for a long time. And that means you have to, in most cases, have access to energy, and you have to have access to quality workers. Those are obvious resources, but you also need to make sure that you have access to clean resources. And the only way we can make sure we have clean resources is if we manage this properly and we think ahead while doing this. Most governments are reluctant to do that because that might mean slower growth opportunities at first. I'm not sure that that's entirely true, but that's a view that many leaders around the world share. And so, we've heard a few other comments about trying to be a different sort of African city, and we aren't in particular wedded to, say, high fossil fuel use, not counting ESCOM. And so we can do a number of things that maybe other cities have not been able to do, and really be a model to the rest of the world.
And finally, Executive Mayor, to touch on a contentious issue right now, but it's not specific to South Africa. Of course, we are seeing all over the world the issue of migration not being a great one in terms of how many immigrants are treated in the host countries because of a host of issues that of illegal migration also happening. But as we talk about, intra-Africa trade and South African companies and African companies taking advantage of doing business with each other, how is the city thinking about in terms of ensuring that the migration policy or the migration model we create harmony. We don't create an antagonistic environment in which some people feel this individual is taking my job, and there isn't the kind of unrest that we have seen, unfortunately, of late.
Yeah, thank you, Fifi. I think you definitely have said that it's a topic that might be not so much relevant to what we are doing here. Suffice to say that the migration is a global problem. It's not only a problem that happens here in South Africa. It happens everywhere around the world, and it's a question of how national governments manage it, because of it's got to be managed from that level. We are the recipients because of migrants come to our cities looking for opportunities, looking for investment potentials, and looking for job opportunities. Hence, we are the victims, if you like, of the whole issue around migration. But it is how the national governments manages it in terms of ensuring that the Home Affairs does its due diligence into ensuring that everybody who comes to our shores comes so legally. And I think Adama was saying that one principle of investment is that you got to obey the rules and the laws of your host country. So
sure.
It goes without saying that even with migration is the same principle.
For sure. But just specifically one last question. We're saying there's Nigerian companies that are watching this. There's companies in Kenya that are watching this broadcast. There's companies in Ghana. For a businessman who is looking to do business with the city of Tshwane, bringing investments in here, is the investment safe?
Yes, of course. That is why the tagline is that Tshwane is open and ready for business.
To everyone.
To everyone. And we are cutting the red tape and we are putting the red carpet for you. So it all happens within the confinements of the rule of law.
Well, I think that is the opportune place to end this discussion. Executive Mayor, thank you so much for hosting us in your city here today. And that does wrap up the conversation that we have had at the Trade and Investment Summit here in Tshwane. Just one last congratulations, or rather one last outro from our panelists. We were in conversation with the Executive Mayor of the city of Tshwane, Councillor Stevens Mokhalapa, also Professor Ronald Wall from Wits University, Mr. Adamo Labara, the IFC's country manager for Southern Africa, Prof. Stephen Koch, the head of the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria. And that is where we leave it for you for today. Of course, the summit is taking place over the next 2 days, so do keep a firm watch out on all the news and developments and projects that will be announced in the next 2 days. It is in the build-up to the National Investment Summit that will be taking place, I believe, in November. But from us here in the capital of Southern Africa, it's bye for now.